When soldiers bled, bankers got rich. For some, the Second World War wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. Before we dive into one of history's darkest financial secrets, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end, because the last story we're going to share will truly shock you. What you're about to hear is not a war story, it's a money story. The kind that rewrote history quietly, behind the noise of gunfire. When the world descended into chaos in 1939, most people saw destruction, but a select few saw demand. Demand for steel, for oil, for bullets, for death itself. These weren't soldiers or generals. They were the financiers, industrialists, and arms manufacturers who turned warfare into one of humanity's most profitable businesses. Every bomb dropped, every tank produced, every boot laced. It all meant money. And for those who knew how to play the game, war wasn't hell, it was heaven. Let's rewind to the eve of World War II. The Great Depression had crippled global economies. Banks had collapsed, industries had frozen, and unemployment gripped millions. But while the public starved, boardrooms whispered. War, they realized, could restart the machine. Germany rearmed under Hitler's regime. The United States prepared, just in case. Britain scrambled to rebuild its navy. And in the middle of it all, a new kind of empire emerged. One built not on land, but on contracts. Companies like DuPont, General Motors, Ford, Shell, and IG Farben didn't just manufacture, they maneuvered. They supplied whichever side paid. Some did business with the Allies, others with the Axis, and some, shockingly, did business with both. In smoky boardrooms, you'd hear conversations like, if we don't supply them, someone else will. The sentiment was clear. Gentlemen, war is business, and business must continue. While the world's citizens tightened their belts and rationed bread, factory owners cashed in on record profits. DuPont's earnings skyrocketed by an incredible 300% between 1939 and 1945. Oil magnates saw their fortunes double as tanks and planes devoured fuel. Even Coca-Cola found a way to profit, shipping its syrup across war zones to boost morale and secure its brand's future. But the true puppet masters weren't in the factories. They were sitting in glass towers. Bankers from J.P. Morgan, Chase, and the financiers behind Standard Oil arranged secret deals that spanned borders. They funneled credit through neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden. Money moved faster than armies. Gold crossed lines that no soldier could. Imagine this. As bombs fell on London, board meetings in New York were already discussing post-war reconstruction contracts. When tanks rolled into Poland, stock markets were busy predicting which steel company's stock would surge the following week. War was chaos on the surface, but beneath it was orderly, calculated greed. Even the Nazis' economic rise had international fingerprints. In the 1930s, long before the US entered the war, American companies helped design and supply industrial infrastructure for Hitler's war machine. Ford's German subsidiary produced vehicles for the Wehrmacht. IBM's infamous punch card machines were used to track production efficiency. And horrifyingly, human lives in concentration camps. This wasn't just a story of a few bad apples. It was a systemic feature of global capitalism at the time. But this isn't just a story of collusion. It's a story of evolution, how war transformed capitalism forever. Before World War II, industry was about supply and demand. After World War II, it became about influence. Nations no longer merely built weapons, they built entire economies around them. Governments discovered that to maintain power, you had to keep the war machine humming. President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously said America must become the great arsenal of democracy. What he didn't say was that it also became the great engine of profit. Factories that once made cars started making tanks. Those tanks fed jobs, wages, and political loyalty back home. Suddenly, destruction became a pillar of economic stability. A disturbing paradox was born. Peace became too expensive. By 1942, over 300,000 businesses in the US alone had war contracts. Every bomb dropped meant employment. Every soldier drafted meant another order was filled. War had become a self-sustaining economic cycle. And yet, outside the factories and boardrooms, young men died by the millions. From the beaches of Normandy to the frozen fields of Stalingrad, from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the devastation of Hiroshima, the blood of nations was exchanged for stock dividends. You see, wars don't just destroy. They redistribute, not just territory, but wealth. The richest 1% emerged from the ashes of war even richer than before. The poor and the working class returned home to rebuild ruins, often with little to show for their sacrifice. But here's where the story gets even darker. When World War II ended, the world swore, never again. But for the men who'd gotten rich from the conflict, never again sounded like bad business. Because if war made them rich once, could it happen again? The system they had perfected wasn't dismantled, it was upgraded. Stay with me, because in our next video, we'll uncover how these war profiteers reinvented themselves, hiding behind charity, politics, and the banner of progress. The corporations that fed on blood didn't die after 1945. They evolved. And the last one on our list, the one you'll meet at the very end, will change how you think about every hero billionaire you see today. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. When the guns fell silent, most people thought the profiteers of war would fade away in shame. But they didn't. They evolved. Because the end of the war wasn't the end of business, it was the beginning of a new empire. In 1945, the world was celebrating peace. But for the industrial giants that fueled the war, peace was a problem. Their factories, built to churn out tanks, bombs, and bullets, couldn't just shut down. Millions of workers depended on them. Stockholders demanded profit. Politicians feared mass unemployment. So, quietly, they found a new way to keep the machine running. They called it Reconstruction. Europe was in ruins. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and London were reduced to ashes. And where there is ruin, there is opportunity. Massive American corporations like General Electric, DuPont, and Standard Oil shifted gears from destruction to rebuilding. They didn't just supply materials, they shaped the new global order. On paper, they were rebuilding nations. In reality, they were rebuilding markets, ensuring that the same money that financed the war would now profit from the peace. It was the most brilliant reinvention in capitalist history. Take the Marshall Plan, for example. It was a $13 billion US initiative to rebuild Europe. To the public, it was an act of generosity. But to the corporations, it was an open checkbook. Every single dollar that left Washington returned to American industries through contracts for steel, cement, oil, and machinery. For every home rebuilt, a corporation got paid. For every bridge restored, a balance sheet grew. War profiteering had simply changed its name from defense to development. But not everyone was applauding. In private memos and declassified documents, whispers of warning began to circulate. Concerns that this cycle of profiting from destruction would never end. The war economy had fused with the global one. Peace had become conditional. Let's take a closer look. DuPont, which made fortunes manufacturing explosives, rebranded itself as a producer of household innovation. Nylon, plastics, paints, all were byproducts of wartime chemistry. Their slogan changed, but the chemistry of profit didn't. Boeing, born from building fighter planes, started producing commercial airliners using the same technology that once delivered bombs. IBM, which provided systems for military logistics, now powered international trade. And then came the oil barons. During the war, oil was oxygen. Without it, tanks couldn't roll, ships couldn't sail, and planes couldn't fly. When peace came, oil didn't lose its power, it gained more. Because the entire global infrastructure was now completely dependent on it. Enter the Seven Sisters, 7 massive oil companies, including Shell, Exxon, and BP, that carved up the world's petroleum reserves after World War II like spoils of victory. While soldiers were returning home, these corporations were quietly redrawing the maps of the Middle East, Africa, and South America. War gave us access, one oil executive once said. Peace gave us control. Behind closed doors, these companies formed cartels, fixed prices, and negotiated directly with governments. The world's energy was now in private hands, the very same hands that had profited from the war. But perhaps the most powerful transformation came from the arms industry itself. After World War II, the US realized that weapon production couldn't just stop. Factories had been nationalized, jobs depended on contracts, and rivals, especially the Soviet Union, were arming up fast. This began a new era, the permanent war economy. Military spending became a way of life. Companies like Lockheed, Raytheon, and Northrop found their golden age in the Cold War that followed. But their roots, their fortunes, all began right here, in the ashes of 1945. And while the public celebrated peace, boardrooms celebrated something else entirely: stability. As long as the world remained divided, the money would never stop flowing. But the profits weren't just financial. They were political. These corporations started influencing foreign policy, lobbying governments to protect their interests abroad. Wars were no longer just fought by nations. They were fought by shareholders. If oil is life, one senator whispered in 1952, then the corporations are the pulse. This wasn't paranoia. It was the truth. By the mid-1950s, some of the same industrial families who armed World War II were now funding political campaigns, think tanks, and intelligence projects. They didn't just make the weapons, they helped decide where they would be used. So what happens when a system built on conflict runs out of a war? It creates new ones: the Korean War, Vietnam, the Cold War arms race. Each conflict brought a new generation of millionaires, often the sons and grandsons of the men who profited from World War II. The names changed, but the motive didn't. And behind it all, a haunting pattern emerged. Every global crisis seemed to benefit the same people. Every boom and bust, every invasion, every humanitarian intervention was followed by contracts, reconstruction, and expansion. The system had learned how to turn chaos into dividends. So ask yourself, was war ever really about victory, or was it about continuity? Because as soldiers were buried, fortunes rose. The battlefield shifted from trenches to boardrooms. And soon, the new war wasn't about ideology, it was about resources. In our next video, we'll uncover how the very companies that profited from World War II's destruction helped ignite the next global conflicts, quietly shaping the post-war world while pretending to protect it. When the war ended, the world thought empires had fallen. In truth, they'd only changed form. The battlefield became the boardroom, the generals became businessmen, and the spoils of war became the foundation of an invisible empire. When the peace treaties were signed, victory parades filled the streets. But behind the applause, a quiet power grab began. It wasn't about territory anymore. It was about infrastructure, currency, and control. The war had left Europe and Asia in ashes, their economies paralyzed. The United States, however, emerged stronger than ever. Half of the world's industrial capacity now lay in American hands. The dollar became the new global lifeline, and the men who controlled it became the new monarchs. Through global lending institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Western powers offered reconstruction loans to devastated nations. But those loans came with strings: policy control, trade access, and corporate privileges. It was colonialism reinvented through finance. And who do you think funded those institutions? The same financial families that had profited during the war. The same corporations that built the bombs now built the banks. From Rockefeller's Standard Oil to Morgan's banking networks, from DuPont's chemicals to General Electric's machines, the world rebuilt itself under private ownership. Nations borrowed, corporations lent, and debt became the new weapon. Why invade a country, one post-war economist wrote privately, when you can own its debt? It was a system far cleaner than conquest and infinitely more profitable. Each steel beam, each new factory, each dam built in the name of peace came stamped with the logos of wartime manufacturers. Peace had become another branch of industry. But something else was happening in the shadows, something darker. As the US and the Soviet Union entered the Cold War, corporations saw another opportunity: perpetual fear. The threat of communism justified endless arms production. The propaganda of freedom versus tyranny masked an economic engine that never shut down. Defense spending exploded. Secret research projects, covert operations, and black budgets were flooded with money that never had to be accounted for publicly. And who ran those operations? The same men who once managed wartime logistics. In 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency was born, and many of its earliest contractors were former industrial magnates. Aircraft companies, oil suppliers, and data firms all received massive secret funding. The lines between private business and government blurred until they became one. The CIA's early missions were often less about defense and more about protecting economic interests abroad. When national leaders in Latin America or the Middle East tried to nationalize their resources, coups suddenly erupted, many traced back to corporate lobbying. As a declassified report later read, "For every revolution, there was a contract to lose." These weren't random geopolitical moves. They were asset protections disguised as ideology, and with each intervention, corporate networks expanded. By the 1950s, a new class of untouchable billionaires had emerged, the war generation magnates. They controlled oil, arms, technology, and currency. Their companies weren't national anymore. They were supranational, loyal to profit, not to flag. They attended secretive summits like Bretton Woods and the Bilderberg Group, meetings that set the rules for the post-war world. There, politicians smiled for cameras, while executives drafted trade systems that ensured corporate dominance for decades. It was the quiet birth of the global military-industrial complex. When President Eisenhower warned of it in 1961, he wasn't speculating. He was terrified. He'd seen how power had shifted from governments to industries, how the real decision-makers no longer wore uniforms. "In the councils of government," he said, "we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex." But by then, it was too late. The complex was already the beating heart of the world economy. Each war created more contracts. Each conflict justified more surveillance, more data, more influence. And as the Cold War expanded, the war that made millionaires never truly ended. It just went global. War had become routine, and so had profit. By 1968, U.S. defense contractors had multiplied their wartime wealth tenfold. Private intelligence firms emerged, corporate lobbyists wrote defense policies, and arms dealers became celebrities among the elite. But here's where the illusion deepens. While governments appeared to fund wars, the money often came from loans. Loans issued by private banks and repaid by taxpayers. The cycle was airtight. War debt became national debt. National debt fed banks. Banks financed arms. Arms fueled wars. Wars caused debt. A perfect, profitable circle. As the decades passed, these systems expanded into new industries. Pharmaceuticals, surveillance, and digital information, all born from wartime innovation, all feeding from the same endless stream of fear. Some say this was inevitable, that war and profit are simply human nature. But that's too easy, because behind every decision, there were names, faces, signatures. Real people who watched the world burn and called it growth. They called it defense. They called it stability. But you and I know it by another name: empire. And this empire wasn't built on loyalty to nations. It was built on the currency of chaos. Now here's where it gets chilling. The companies born from World War II didn't just influence governments, they began creating them. From coup-backed regimes in Africa to Western-backed dictatorships in the Middle East, corporations selected leaders who would keep the oil flowing and the weapons selling. The profits weren't just massive, they were generational. By the 1970s, Family dynasties that had started in WWII were among the richest in the world, controlling not just industries but information, media, and the entire narrative. They didn't need to hide, because the world now believed war was inevitable, a natural part of progress. But what if it wasn't inevitable? What if war became our permanent economy by design? In the next chapter, we go deeper into the covert networks, offshore accounts, and secret foundations that kept this machine alive. How post-war profiteers built hidden kingdoms so vast they could vanish entire economies overnight. Wars end, but money doesn't. When the bombs stopped falling, a different kind of weapon began moving, silent, invisible, and untouchable. They called it Reconstruction. But behind the curtain, it was something else entirely. Ghost money. Before we begin, remember, the final revelation will absolutely shock you, so stay till the end. Because what started in 1945 didn't stop, it just went underground. The world may have rebuilt itself, but beneath its polished surface flowed rivers of untraceable cash, a shadow economy born from conflict. Governments lost track of billions in recovery funds. But private investors and intelligence agencies knew exactly where it went. In the aftermath of the war, enormous sums of looted gold, stolen assets, and seized industrial wealth were laundered through neutral countries. Switzerland became the beating heart of secrecy. Numbered accounts became the perfect hiding place for fortunes too dirty to declare and too valuable to destroy. And among those early clients, former industrial barons, military profiteers, and high-ranking officials from both sides of the war. They didn't see enemies, they saw opportunities. Documents later revealed that Western intelligence agencies quietly protected certain financiers, ensuring their survival in exchange for access to their money networks. The Cold War had begun, and ghost money was now a weapon. The CIA, freshly born and hungry for covert power, found itself with a new dilemma. How to fund secret operations without public accountability? The answer? Hidden war profits. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, vast sums from black market gold, offshore accounts, and even recovered Nazi assets were funneled into secret trusts, offshore funds that financed everything from coups to propaganda to weapons programs. Declassified memos stamped "Eyes Only" tell the story. Certain post-war funds may be redirected, one memo read, for the purpose of securing influence in strategic regions. That influence often meant overthrowing governments that resisted Western control. Ghost money financed covert coups in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Congo in 1960. It bankrolled mercenary forces, propped up dictators, and silenced journalists who got too close. And yet, it never appeared on a single budget sheet. The same companies that armed nations during World War II now managed covert trade routes, moving oil, steel, and rare minerals across borders under shell company names. By the 1970s, these networks had become so complex that even governments couldn't trace them fully. Entire islands, the Cayman, Jersey, Liechtenstein, transformed into offshore sanctuaries. It was there that the modern offshore system was born. Here's what most people don't realize. This system didn't start as tax evasion. It started as war evasion. A way to move profits from one side of a conflict to the other without consequence. The men who had sold weapons to both the Allies and Axis powers now sold security consulting, infrastructure projects, or reconstruction bonds. All euphemisms for transferring enormous sums of ghost money through invisible pipelines. Imagine a bank executive in Geneva in 1974 whispering to a client, "Your funds are safe here. No government, no journalist, no tax office will ever know." The client asks, "And if there's another war?" The banker replies, "Then, sir, you'll be ready." That quiet conversation was replicated thousands of times across the financial capitals of the world. And with that, a new type of elite emerged. Men who didn't need nations, armies, or borders. Their battlefield was finance itself. As these hidden funds multiplied, The old empires rebranded. Colonial rule ended, but corporate ownership began. Instead of soldiers, contracts were deployed. Instead of invasion, investment. Billions flowed into newly independent nations under the promise of development, but each loan came with clauses that locked them into debt dependency for decades. Entire countries became collateral, and the lenders were the same networks born from wartime profiteering. By the late 20th century, ghost money had evolved into what journalists now call dark finance, unregulated capital, off-record profits, and anonymous trusts controlling trillions. Leaks like the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers decades later would reveal fragments of these systems, but never their origin, because their origin was war. Many of the offshore firms exposed had roots tracing directly back to the post-World War II financial structures. The same law firms, the same banking families, just under different names. A financial historian once said, "The modern billionaire was born not in Silicon Valley, but in the ashes of 1945. By now, the ghost money wasn't just sitting idle, it was shaping politics. Funding campaigns, media empires, and think tanks that promoted policies favorable to deregulation. It wasn't about profit anymore. It was about preservation, preserving power, preserving control, preserving the illusion that wars are fought for freedom, when in truth they're fought for flow, the flow of money. From oil fields to defense contracts, the template never changed. Ghost money financed destruction, then funded reconstruction, creating a perfect cycle of endless wealth for those behind the curtain. And every war, every conflict, every humanitarian intervention became another excuse to expand it. But here's the chilling truth. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a design. A system so efficient that even those who opposed it depended on it. Today, over $32 trillion sits in offshore accounts, untaxed, untracked, and largely unaccounted for. That's more than the GDP of the United States and China combined. Yet this ghost empire isn't seen, it's felt, in inflated prices, manipulated markets, and entire economies rising or falling on whispers. And as technology advanced, the ghosts adapted. Crypto wallets, shell trusts, private equity firms. Different names, same invisible hands. Because here's what they understood decades ago. Real power isn't owning armies or land. It's controlling the flow of capital. That's the inheritance of the war millionaires. That's the machine they built. The one that never sleeps, never bleeds, never stops. And the deeper you dig, the darker it gets. In every major conflict since 1945, there's a signature. Invisible but unmistakable. Money that moves faster than missiles. Power that shifts without elections. And somewhere, in a vault no one can find, the ghosts are still cashing in. Stay tuned. Because in our next episode, the heiress who bought her own disappearance will meet the woman who inherited one of these ghost fortunes and vanished trying to escape it. Thank you for watching. If this story opened your eyes, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. She inherited everything, the money, the name, the legacy of a world rebuilt on blood and steel. But she also inherited the ghosts. And one day, she simply disappeared. Before we dive into this mystery, make sure you stay until the very end, because the final twist will shock you more than any headline ever could. Her name was Elizabeth von Harburg, or at least that's what the records say. Born in 1947, in the ruins of Hamburg, she was the only child of a man who'd made a fortune selling ball bearings and engine parts to both Allied and Axis suppliers during the war. Her father died in 1954, leaving behind not just factories and shipping contracts, but also a network of Swiss accounts so secret that even the banks used code names instead of numbers. When she turned 18, she was flown to Zurich by private plane. There, in a smoke-filled boardroom, a banker placed a slim black folder in front of her. Inside were documents linking her family's holdings to companies that quietly controlled parts of Europe's oil transport network and indirectly to post-war defense contractors in the US. The banker leaned in and said softly, "You will never need to work a day in your life, Fräulein, but you must never ask where the money came from." That single line, whispered in 1965, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Through the 1970s, Elizabeth lived the glamorous life of a European socialite. Paris in the spring, New York in the fall. Lavish parties in Monaco, where oil executives, generals, and intelligence officers mingled as if the war had never happened. But behind the polite smiles and clinking champagne glasses, they had a cruel nickname for her: the Ghost's Daughter. Everyone knew her father's fortune came from the gray areas of history, those places where neutrality, business, and betrayal blurred into one. She began to suspect that her inheritance wasn't just money, it was power disguised as wealth. During a gala in Geneva, a young journalist cornered her, asking, "Miss von Harburg, is it true your father supplied both sides of the war?" Elizabeth smiled faintly and replied, "He supplied the world with its conscience. Everyone paid for it." That cryptic response made headlines for days, but privately, Elizabeth was unraveling. She started digging into the origins of her family's assets, traveling through archives, hiring private detectives, and uncovering contracts stamped by both Nazi and Allied offices. Every discovery led to another locked door, and every door led back to the same place, a trust in Zurich, built on wartime profits laundered through so-called reconstruction projects. When she confronted her bankers, they warned her to stop digging. When she kept going, strange things started to happen. Her phone would click whenever she picked it up. Letters vanished from her mail. Journalists she met with suddenly refused to go on record. She was being watched. In 1982, Elizabeth made her final public appearance at a charity event in London for war refugees. Her voice trembled as she gave a short, chilling speech. "We speak of peace as though it were a gift, but peace is a business, and some of us were born shareholders." 2 weeks later, she vanished. The official story was simple. Her boat capsized off the coast of Capri. No body was ever found. The tabloids called it a tragic accident, but among those who knew her, no one believed it. And here's why. The day before she vanished, Elizabeth transferred nearly $400 million from her Zurich accounts into a foundation registered in Panama. Its stated purpose? To fund investigations into wartime economic crimes. And then, there was just silence. For years, rumors swirled. Some said she'd fled to South America under a new name. Others claimed she was eliminated by the same powerful financial networks she tried to expose. But the truth might be even stranger. In 1999, a historian studying the Bormann Flight Capital Network, an alleged Nazi escape finance route, discovered a folder in a declassified CIA archive. Inside were memos referencing the Harburg assets and a female intermediary who became a liability. The document was dated just 3 days before Elizabeth's disappearance. One chilling line stood out. Subject aware of funds' origins. Recommends self-extraction. Surveillance ongoing. Self-extraction. A phrase used during the Cold War for informants who staged their own disappearances to escape danger. Did Elizabeth vanish to protect herself? Or was she silenced to protect a fortune built on secrets? We may never know for sure. But in 2003, someone using her family's trust name quietly donated $50 million to a human rights organization that tracks stolen Nazi wealth. The payment was made through 5 different shell companies. There was no sender, no signature, just a wire trail that ended in Zurich, the same city where it all began. Maybe she bought her freedom, maybe she bought her silence, or maybe she bought her own disappearance. Whatever the truth, Elizabeth von Harburg became a symbol of something much bigger, the hidden price of inherited power. She was born into a world built on war money, and she tried to destroy it, only to vanish inside its machinery. Her story is a stark reminder that every great fortune carries a shadow. Behind every shining skyscraper, every luxury yacht, every billionaire's empire, there's a history that no one wants to read aloud. A history that began with a war that created millionaires. But here's where the story takes a turn you won't see coming. Everything you've just heard didn't end in 1945 or even with Elizabeth's disappearance. It's happening right now, all around us. In our next segment, The New Wars, we'll uncover how those same wartime networks evolved into the modern empires of defense, technology, and global control. We'll show you why, in an age of drones and data, war is still the most profitable business on Earth. Trust me, what you're about to learn will change the way you see the world. The weapons changed, the targets changed, but the business stayed the same. What began in 1940 with tanks and oil fields now runs on data, fear, and precision drones. The war machine didn't die. It evolved. Before we begin, make sure you stay until the end, because what you'll hear in this final chapter will change the way you see every modern war, every headline, every billionaire tech launch. Because this is the moment you realize that the same system that made millionaires from World War II is still running today, stronger than ever. When the Cold War ended, the world cheered. People thought the great arms race was finally over. But in boardrooms and classified briefings, the architects of conflict had already found their next frontier. Defense contractors merged with tech companies. Data firms began working with intelligence agencies. And a new kind of warfare, digital, decentralized, and incredibly profitable, was born. The old war millionaires built their fortunes on oil, steel, and munitions. The new ones built theirs on algorithms, surveillance, and information. The same way World War II had industrialists competing to supply bombs, today's corporations compete to supply software, tools that track movements, predict behavior, and automate decisions. Only this time, the battlefield isn't Europe, it's everywhere. In 2003, as tanks rolled into Iraq, defense stock values soared overnight. Companies like Halliburton, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin made record profits. Private contractors billed billions for reconstruction, security, and logistics. It was the same pattern all over again: destruction followed by contracts, chaos followed by cash flow. A secret report from the Pentagon that year even described modern warfare as economically self-sustaining. In other words, once started, it paid for itself. And behind the contracts, familiar names. Many of the same families and corporations that profited from WWII had diversified through holding companies, trusts, and mergers into the modern defense economy. The ghosts of the 1940s had traded tanks for code. Then came the War on Terror, and the profit margins exploded. Over $6 trillion spent globally. Thousands of private firms were contracted for everything from drone maintenance to border surveillance. And each time a new conflict arose, billions shifted, quietly, instantly, into the same kind of untraceable funds that once hid Nazi gold. But what makes the 21st century even darker is that now, war doesn't even need to be declared for fortunes to grow. Every cyber attack, every political tension, every fear-mongering headline spikes defense shares. Markets move like soldiers. Algorithms react faster than bullets. And someone, somewhere, always wins. That's the new battlefield. One where money moves invisibly, just like it did in 1945. Only now it travels at the speed of light. And if you think this is just about defense, think again. In 2016, major tech firms began partnering with the military-industrial complex, supplying AI-based targeting systems, predictive policing tools, and digital surveillance networks. It's not barbed wire and bunkers anymore, it's data, satellites, and code. The new arms dealers are software engineers. The new battlefield generals are CEOs. Every upload, every camera feed, every GPS ping, it's all part of the system. A system born from the ashes of World War II. The war that made millionaires never ended. It just learned to hide in plain sight. Remember Elizabeth von Harburg, the heiress who vanished after trying to expose her family's wartime fortune? Her foundation's last donation in 2003 went to a startup investigating offshore war financing. That company was quietly acquired 2 years later by a cybersecurity firm now contracted by multiple governments. Her name was erased. Her legacy was absorbed into the system she tried to fight. The same foundation that once tracked Nazi gold now develops digital surveillance tools. The circle complete. Today, the same ghost money that built post-war Europe funds cyber weapons, global intelligence, and private military networks. They've replaced steel with silicon, but the profit still smells like gunpowder. And maybe that's the greatest trick ever pulled. Convincing the world that war is a tragedy, when for some it's just business. They tell us wars are fought for freedom, for democracy, for justice. But in balance sheets and offshore accounts, freedom has a price tag, democracy has a contract, and justice is whatever the shareholders say it is. Because behind every headline, every humanitarian slogan, every call for peacekeeping, there's a spreadsheet. So ask yourself, who profits when a war starts? Who profits when it ends? And who profits when it never really ends at all? Because in the modern world, war is no longer a tragedy, it's an economy. And every soldier, every citizen, every taxpayer plays their part in funding it. From World War II to the present day, the formula hasn't changed. Conflict creates chaos, chaos creates contracts, and contracts create billionaires. Only the faces have changed. Only the excuses have evolved. Only the ghosts have gone digital. The war that made millionaires didn't just shape our past, it built our present. Every skyscraper, every oil deal, every glowing screen traces back to a world that learned one brutal truth. The easiest way to build wealth is to destroy something first. Today, when drones fly, when borders burn, when currencies collapse, the same invisible network profits. The same ghost empire lives on, whispering through markets and meetings, ensuring that the world never quite runs out of conflict. Because if peace ever truly came, they'd go broke. This was the war that made millionaires. A story of how one global conflict didn't just rewrite history, it rewired humanity's most dangerous addiction, profit through pain. If this story opened your eyes, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Blood and Fortune for more true stories the world tried to erase. Because next week's story will make this one look tame.